The retirement wing sat behind the Sonoran Venom Research Institute's main extraction lab, a row of climate-controlled enclosures where snakes that had failed the facility's production screening waited for transfer to a non-extraction reptile sanctuary 2 states away. Rowan Ashby had been coming here for 5 mornings, not to acquire venom. The institute wasn't releasing any snake to an outside handler for extraction purposes that required licensing she was still finishing, but to observe, one enclosure at a time, the way a person observes something they are not yet ready to call a plan. She worked the same way each morning. She would sit outside an enclosure well back from the glass and simply watch. How long a snake took to settle after the lights came on, whether its tongue flicking and body posture stayed tense and defensive for the full hour she observed, or gradually eased into something closer to calm, and whether, days apart, the same snake's baseline tension was dropping the more familiar it became with a quiet, unhurried presence outside its enclosure rather than the facility's standard rotation of different handlers moving quickly through a production schedule. A snake that never settled at all told her something real about its temperament. A snake that eased visibly over repeated quiet visits told her something the facility's fast production screening had never had time to notice. She had learned to read that difference from her grandfather Walt Ashby's field journals. 5 of them she had found in his workshop the winter after his death, filled with 35 years of notes from the private venom collection operation he had run for regional anti-venom labs, using a slow, low-stress method that predated the Institute's high-throughput screening protocols by decades. The Institute's animal care supervisor, a young woman named Denise Okafor, who oversaw the retirement wing during the facility's wind-down, had stopped asking why Rowan came. She would nod from the hallway door and go back to her own work, and Rowan would sit outside enclosure after enclosure with a notebook, timing settle behavior, cross-referencing each snake's production file against what she was actually watching happen in front of her. She had reached the 9th enclosure that Thursday morning, in the cool, early light of October, when Dr. Owen Faraday, who had directed the Institute for 11 years, came down the hallway with his coffee and saw her notebook. Owen had built the Institute's production model on a fast, standardized milking rotation. Each snake handled under bright lab lighting on a tight schedule, extracted, measured, and returned, with venom yield scored against a strict threshold that determined whether a snake stayed in active production or was retired from the program permanently. Snakes that consistently produced low measured yield or that reacted with prolonged defensive agitation that slowed the rotation down were retired, both because the Institute's shrinking grant funding couldn't justify keeping underperforming animals and because a stressed, uncooperative snake posed a higher handling risk to staff working on a tight schedule. He looked at Rowan's notebook now, pages of timed settle observations for snakes the Institute had already written off. He said, "Rowan, what are you doing out here?" She said, "Watching how they settle." He said, "Those are scheduled for sanctuary transfer at the end of the month." "They're out of the program." She said, "I know. That's why I'm watching now, before it's too late to matter." Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Rowan Ashby had grown up in Ocotillo, Arizona, on land her grandfather Walt had worked for over 3 decades, running a small, licensed venom collection operation that supplied regional anti-venom research labs long before larger institutional facilities like Sonoran existed to formalize the same basic work at scale. Walt had built his reputation on yield numbers that consistently outperformed larger operations, a fact he attributed, in journal after journal, not to any secret technique, but simply to patience, long acclimation periods, minimal handling, and a refusal to rush an animal that hadn't settled, principles that had no place in a production model built around throughput and fixed handling windows. Rowan had gone to work for the Institute herself at 26 as a junior extraction technician trained in Owen's fast rotation method, and had been laid off 7 months earlier when the Institute's primary federal grant lapsed and the program cut its technical staff from 9 to 3. She had been finishing the state licensing requirements to operate her own small collection facility since, living in the house she'd inherited from her grandfather 2 years earlier, on the same land where his enclosures still stood mostly empty, and spending most evenings in a quiet she had not experienced since before the Institute job began. The layoff had come at a strange angle to her grief, close enough to the second anniversary of Walt's death that the two losses had started to blur together in her mind, one quiet house and one empty career arriving almost at once. She had spent that first autumn doing the kind of slow, half-avoidant work a person does around a loss they aren't ready to face directly. Cleaning out gutters and fixing fences on the property without once opening the workshop door where Walt's old records still sat exactly as he'd left them, until the stillness of an empty schedule finally pushed her out there on a cold afternoon in December, looking, she told herself, only for a specific tool she needed. She had found Walt's journals that winter, 5 composition notebooks in his workshop, going back to the 1980s, filled with his small, deliberate handwriting, individual snake histories, yield measurements taken over full seasons rather than single sessions, and here and there in the margins. The kind of observation a man writes down because he doesn't want to lose it even when no institution is paying him to record it. She found the sentence that mattered in the third notebook, dated 1994, in a margin note beside a page of yield comparisons for a snake he'd taken in from another operation that had written it off as unproductive. The big labs score a snake in one sitting under bright lights with a stranger's hands on it and call the number final. I have watched the same animal give a third of its real yield that way, and its full measured yield 8 weeks later, once it had stopped treating every handling session as a threat to survive. A defensive snake is not a low-yield snake. It is often simply a stressed one, and stress and venom production work against each other in ways a single rushed session will never show you. She read it 3 times. She had no way to ask her grandfather exactly which snakes had recovered their yield over time, because Walt had been gone 2 years and the other private operators he'd corresponded with across the region were mostly retired or gone themselves. What she had was the sentence: a defensive snake is not a low-yield snake. It is often simply a stressed one. She spent the rest of that fall and most of the winter reading everything she could find about stress physiology in venomous reptiles and its documented effect on venom gland output. Not the general herpetology material, which mostly treated venom yield as a fixed biological trait, but the harder research on how chronic handling stress measurably suppressed gland secretion over time, and on acclimation protocols that allowed captive venomous snakes to habituate to a consistent, low-stress environment before any extraction was attempted. She read about cortisol-equivalent stress markers in reptiles, about how repeated exposure to unfamiliar handlers under time pressure kept a snake's baseline defensive arousal elevated indefinitely, and about documented cases, mostly in older, smaller operations like her grandfather's, where snakes retired from institutional programs as low producers had gone on to yield normally, once given months rather than minutes to acclimate to a single familiar environment. She read about how to assess a snake's genuine, unrecoverable low productivity. Animals with underdeveloped venom glands, documented illness, or age-related decline, as distinct from ordinary handling stress that would ease with patience, a distinction that mattered enormously because she was not going to request custody of any animal she couldn't house and manage safely and appropriately. She spent 2 months of that winter completing the additional state licensing and facility inspection requirements for holding retired production animals specifically, because she was not going to guess at what was safe, legal, or humane. She had read, trained, and prepared for 4 months before she ever asked Owen Faraday whether she could formally request transfer of the retirement wing's animals instead of the sanctuary. Owen had said he'd consider it once her licensing cleared, though privately he thought she was chasing a sentimental long shot on animals that had already failed the only screening the Institute's shrinking budget could afford to run. Grant funding didn't pay for months of quiet acclimation. It paid for a clean yield number by a fixed date, and the retired snakes hadn't given one. Rowan's licensing cleared in March, and she took formal custody of the retirement wing's remaining stock. 150 snakes across several rattlesnake species regional to Sonoran's research focus, transferring them to newly built climate-controlled enclosures on her grandfather's land, each one modeled on Walt's own low-stress design. She evaluated every animal individually over the following months, using the same patient observation method her grandfather's journals described, watching steady behavior. And, once an animal showed consistent calm over repeated weeks, attempting a first careful, low-pressure extraction session with proper protective protocol and no production deadline attached to the outcome. Of the 150, roughly 40 showed genuinely low or declining yield even after months of acclimation, consistent with age, prior illness, or underlying gland conditions the Institute's screening had correctly identified, and Rowan referred those animals appropriately to the non-extraction sanctuary exactly as originally planned. The remaining 110, once fully acclimated, produced yield at or above the Institute's own original production threshold, exactly the pattern her grandfather's notebook had described as stress suppression rather than genuine underperformance. She wrote in the notebook she'd started keeping, a 6th volume to sit beside her grandfather's 5, March through August. 150 retired snakes transferred and evaluated over 5 months of acclimation. 40 confirmed genuinely low yield, appropriately retired to sanctuary. 110 reached or exceeded original Institute production thresholds once given time to settle. Grandfather wrote that a defensive snake is not a low-yield snake, it is often simply a stressed one. It took 5 months, not one session, to find out how right he was. Denise Okafor helped coordinate the animal transfers over that spring, staying in closer contact with Rowan's progress than Owen fully realized, because Denise's own uncle had run a small private collection operation 2 counties over for years before retiring, a detail she mentioned almost as an aside during one of the transfer visits. Word of what Rowan was doing reached the feed store in Ocotillo before she had finished the first round of evaluations. A delivery driver named Roy Castellan, who serviced both Rowan's property and the Institute's supply runs, mentioned to Ellen Pruitt at the register that Rowan Ashby had taken custody of over 100 rattlesnakes the Institute had already given up on and was keeping them all on her grandfather's old land. Ellen said, 110 rattlesnakes. On purpose. Living out there alone with them. Roy said, that's what I heard too. Ellen said, that sounds less like a business plan and more like a death wish. The next customer, a rancher named Gene Wexford, who ran cattle on the ridge above Rowan's property and had lost a dog to a rattlesnake bite years earlier, had heard a slightly more alarmed version by the time he reached the register. Gene said, 100 rattlesnakes that a professional research facility already decided weren't worth keeping. If they weren't good enough for trained staff with a whole lab around them, I don't see how one woman alone on that land is any safer with them. A younger woman at the counter, someone new to the area who'd only heard the story secondhand from a coworker, said she'd heard the real number was closer to 300 snakes, and that Rowan had lost her job at the Institute for a safety violation rather than a funding cut, which was why nobody else there wanted anything to do with the animals she'd taken. Ellen said that detail was new to her, but it would explain a lot. Gene said he hadn't heard that part either, but it didn't exactly make him feel better about the whole situation. By the following week, the story circulating at the feed store had settled into confident, near-universal alarm, inflated well past the facts with each retelling, built on a genuine and reasonable fear of venomous snakes rather than casual doubt. What was accurate? Rowan had taken licensed custody of 150 retired research snakes after a funding-related layoff. What had drifted? The count, the invented safety violation, and the certainty with which people repeated a claim treating the Institute's fast production screening as an infallible, permanent verdict on every animal's actual value and manageability, the exact assumption her grandfather's journals had spent 35 years arguing against. Gene Wexford drove down to Rowan's property line himself on a Saturday that summer, once the new enclosures were visible from the road. He said, "Rowan, I heard you took on the Institute's retired snakes." "All of them?" She said, 150, evaluated properly over months, not minutes. 40 were genuinely done, and I sent those on to Sanctuary myself. The other 110 are producing at or above what the Institute originally required of them. He said, the Institute had trained staff and a whole lab. If they couldn't get consistent yield out of these animals, what makes you think you can, alone, out here? She said, the Institute had a production schedule that gave every snake one chance under bright lights with a stranger's hands on it. My grandfather spent 35 years proving that number isn't the same as an animal's actual capacity. I gave these snakes months instead of minutes before I asked anything of them. He said, you really think patience changes what a snake's glands can physically produce? She said, I think stress suppresses output in ways a rush test can't separate from genuine low capacity. Grandfather documented that pattern for 3 decades before I ever needed to read it. He looked at the enclosures a long moment, at a woman standing on land that had housed venomous snakes safely for 35 years under her grandfather's care before hers. He said, I hope you're right for your own sake. I've buried a good dog because of one of these animals, and I don't take the risk lightly. He drove back up the ridge and told the story at the feed store that evening, in a tone still cautious, but slightly less certain than the one he'd used a season earlier. Owen Faraday drove out to Rowan's property himself that fall after Denise mentioned carefully that the state's reptile licensing board had flagged Rowan's facility for an unusually strong compliance and yield report during a routine inspection. He said, Rowan. She said, Owen. He reviewed her yield logs across all 110 producing animals, cross-referencing several against the Institute's own original production files. He said, these numbers match, in some cases exceed, what we originally required to keep these animals in active production. She said, every one of them was scored under your fast rotation. I gave them months of quiet acclimation before a single extraction attempt. He said the Institute never had budget for that kind of timeline. One grant cycle paid for one clean answer by a fixed date. She said, I understand why. I'm not asking you to change a program that no longer exists. I'm asking whether you'd consider a formal referral arrangement for any future retired stock from wherever you land next, before it goes straight to a non-extraction sanctuary. He looked at the enclosures a while longer. He said, I built 11 years of production policy on the idea that one screening session tells you everything worth knowing about an animal. I'm not sure I ever actually tested that assumption the way you just did with data this clean. He agreed to a referral arrangement in principle before he left. A regional pharmaceutical company that manufactured anti-venom for hospitals across 3 states, working through Owen's own remaining professional contacts, once his new position at a smaller research consortium began, reached out to Rowan directly that winter about a standing supply contract. A procurement specialist named Priya Ashford drove out, reviewed Rowan's licensing, her yield documentation, and her facility's safety compliance record in detail, and asked what volume Rowan could commit to on an ongoing basis. Rowan told her the honest number, based on a full season of consistent production across the 110 animals, and Priya said the volume and, more importantly, the documented consistency were exactly what the company's anti-venom production line needed from a smaller regional supplier. She signed a standing contract at a rate Rowan had researched carefully beforehand, close to the higher end of what a licensed, consistent small producer could reasonably command, and said the company would welcome first option on any additional capacity if Rowan's operation grew further. Her nephew, 13 years old and living 2 towns over, had taken to visiting most weekends that second year, always kept well back from the enclosures, at a safe observation distance his aunt insisted on without exception, watching the snakes rest calmly under the enclosure, lighting the patient way Rowan had learned to watch them from a notebook. He said, one Sunday, through the reinforced glass, why did the lab give up on so many of them? Rowan said, because they only had one quick session to make a decision in, and some of these animals needed months, not minutes, to show what they could actually do once they weren't scared. Nobody at the Institute was wrong to want a fast answer. The snakes just weren't built to give one that quickly. He said, how did you know to wait? She said, your great-grandfather wrote it down over 30 years, decades before I needed to read it, watching animals other people had already given up on. I just had to be patient enough and careful enough to test whether he was right. He watched a large diamondback settle deeper into its warm basking spot on the far side of the glass, calm and unhurried. He said, it doesn't look scared of anything now. Rowan said, no, it doesn't. That night, after her nephew had gone home and the enclosures had gone quiet under a November evening, Rowan sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, her 6th beside her grandfather's 5, and wrote the entry the way she wrote every entry, without embellishment. November, 2nd full season. 110 of the original 150 retired snakes in consistent licensed production. Standing supply contracts signed with a regional pharmaceutical anti-venom manufacturer. Cost of the original custody transfer, nothing but licensing fees. Cost of the year it took to prove a whole production model wrong, everything I had left after the layoff. She read the line back to herself. Then she wrote one more. Started with 150 animals a single fast session called finished. 110 were never actually low yield. They were stressed, and stress and venom production have always worked against each other, exactly the way grandfathers spent 35 years trying to explain to anyone who'd rush past an animal instead of sitting still with it. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside her grandfather's 5, the place in the workshop where things got kept for whoever came next. Then she went out to do the last quiet check of the evening, well back from the glass, the way she always did. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been judged, finished on the strength of one rushed evaluation. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever stayed patient with something everyone else had already written off as too dangerous or too far gone to matter, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.